going down. Already.
How's it going, everybody? This is Jordan Pacheco from the Glad Trad podcast. I hope you're doing well. This episode has been a couple months in the making, and I'm uber happy. I have Dr. Peter Kwasniewski on with me. We're going to be talking about one of his new books in particular, but before we even get off to the races, Doctor, I got to tell you, I feel like we've inhabited some of the same circles I've noticed in the past couple of years. I feel like I've interviewed people that you're very close to, Anna Kolonovska being the latest and the greatest. So I'm very, very happy that you're not just a face in front of me for all your other podcasts and for Mass of the Ages, but finally we're sitting down. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you, Jordan. I appreciate it. It's good.
Yeah, I feel like, you know, there's kind of a Catholic meme in the trad circles where you kind of wake up and you have X amount of people's books on your shelves, and your books are just kind of naturally beginning to populate that space for my shelf and my roommate's shelf. So like, I'm gonna retire someday and look over, and it's gonna be like how Matthew Kelly books used to just mysteriously appear on people's shelves.
Oh my gosh. Too. Yes. Except that, well, for better or for worse, I can't just simply give away thousands of free copies.
We'll get there.
I can't spam people with my books.
No, precisely right. Great. Let's get into it, guys. This is the latest book that I have from the good doctor here, Ad Orientem, The Direction That Changes Everything, obviously by Tan Publishing. This book and this content is obviously very near and dear to my heart. So we're going to have a really great conversation on this. One of the big things, especially when I transitioned from going to the Novus Ordo to the traditional Latin Mass, the first thing anyone notices, I think before anything else, is the fact that I was a low Mass, for instance, for me. And the priest walks out and he's not looking at me and he faces away. So in my mind, I'm like, the altar is pushed against the end of the wall here. It's clearly incorporated with the high altar. But why the heck isn't the priest facing me? I was so used to that my whole life. And so breaking down, finally understanding what Ad Orientem is, I think that you've laid it out. I read it through this morning, and I appreciate an important read also being a read of brevity. I think the Catholic Church could do with some more of those every once in a while. But let me ask you kind of your own experience and maybe your motivation for writing the book, because I feel like you also have a couple more extensive books on Ad Orientem and on other liturgical changes. This seems to be a big thing that's in the water right now. And I'm noticing even more Novus Ordos around me where priests are being able to celebrate Mass Ad Orientem. So it's an ancient practice and it hasn't gone away, clearly.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I had a similar experience to you, Jordan, in the sense that I grew up. Well, I don't know if you grew up in a liberal parish, but I mean, I grew up in an environment where I never saw Ad Orientem. I only ever saw the priest facing the people, which became a universal custom after Vatican II, almost overnight. And I did some deep research on this. I don't talk about it in the booklet, but when I researched, how did this become universal when it was never mandated? Okay, this is very important. The Vatican never actually said that. So first of all, Vatican II never said anything about this topic. They just assumed that Mass would continue to be said the way it was as far as the direction of the priest. And then, you know, there was never a moment when the Pope said to everybody, okay, starting on this date, you all have to turn around and you have to take the high altar down and you have to put a table and all that stuff. No, it actually really spread like wildfire through liturgical conferences of liturgists, experts, in the 50s and 60s who were all, most of them, completely convinced, absolutely convinced that the way the early Christians worshipped was in a kind of circle together with the priest facing the people. That's how they envisioned the Last Supper.
I've heard this my entire life, by the way, that like, the ancient practice really was versus popular.
Right. And it's not. It wasn't. And we can go into that, why that's not the case. But they were completely convinced about this, even though there were skeptics back then, like Joseph Jungmann and Louis Bouillet, really important figures who said, wait a minute, the evidence doesn't support what you're saying. But the liturgists went forward with it anyway. Part of the reason they went forward with it is because although they had told themselves this story about the early Christian worship, they also thought this would connect better with modern people. They thought that if you made the Mass more communal, more like a meal, more like, more personal and personable, neighborly, I mean, whatever adjectives you want to put onto that, that you would win people's hearts, that you would somehow overcome what they imagined was a kind of distance or alienation of the people from the sanctuary, from the altar, from the mass. And I don't want to say that it's a bad idea to try to overcome any alienation that there is. I think that it's good to try to do that, but you have to do it in accordance with tradition. And there are traditional ways of doing it, and there are novel and rupturous ways of doing that, which ultimately cause more harm. So anyway, how did this happen overnight? It's because these conferences took place. All these liturgists went back to their dioceses. They said to the bishops, hey, Your Excellency, this is what everybody's talking about. This is the thing to do. And it really just came in that way. It was never mandated. And in fact, and I think I'm just going to throw this out early in the program, the Novus Ordo Missal, the rubrics for it, indicate that the priest is facing eastwards, right?
Really? Like you mean the germ?
Yeah, the general instruction on the Roman Missal. A lot of people don't realize this, but I wrote an article about it. Actually, one of my most read articles at New Liturgical Movement is called The Normativity of Ad Orientem Worship in the Novus Ordo Mass. If you look it up, it has like a gazillion, hundreds of thousands of hits. But and I think that this article is one among many reasons why a lot of Novus Ordo priests, especially of the younger generation, have been trying to get back to it, even within the context of the Novus Ordo. So we have to remember one thing. Already as early as the 1920s, there were progressive liturgists who were doing versus populum with the traditional mass. And the Novus Ordo can be celebrated ad orientem. So this is not exactly the same as a new mass, old mass question. It kind of straddles the lines in that sense. Anyway, I only saw versus populum until I experienced my first traditional Latin mass, at least the first experience that I can consider a genuine one. I had a sort of strange experience in high school that didn't quite work for me. But the first time I was receptive to it was in college. And friends took me to a low mass, and it was, again, this very powerful, very strange, very puzzling, almost bewildering experience of a form of prayer that was so focused somewhere else than the people. Like the whole focus, the entire thing from start to finish was focused somewhere else. And I just perceived it, I intuited, without knowing really anything about this liturgy, that the priest was deeply involved in some mystical, transcendent act that it actually, frankly, it electrified me. I mean, it made me leave wanting to understand what this was. All I had been told was, this is the old mass. This is the way the mass used to be celebrated. And I came out of that saying, what was that? And why was it celebrated that way? And, you just have a million questions, right? You just have a million questions. So I think, anyway, so my experience was probably very similar to yours in that respect.
Yeah, no, it very much was. And I want to pick apart a lot that you've just said there. The first thing I could think of is this beauty. And this is, again, it's such a stark difference. And I've heard very different analogies on ad orientem. I've heard the theological implications, right? We look to the east because our Lord comes from the east. There's these biblical passages that speak to that, the light from the east that we look to. I think aesthetically it helps things. I mean, that's just my my little artistic brain going off. It feels like churches are a lot more functional when we have that way. But I've also heard, like the pilot analogy. I've heard this a lot, right? Going to do, right? That you want your pilot facing the direction. And I'm kind of very interested because what you said earlier was that there was an attempt to essentially make the mass or make the sanctuary more accessible. And I've heard this in a couple different regards with the reforms, and you would know better than I. So if you could break this down for me, was there this general feeling, because I don't necessarily see it in the Doctrines of Vatican II, but even just at the time, that the liturgy was so divided, of the clergy doing their thing and the laity doing their thing? And if only we had, is a goal to get more converts that way? Like, is there idea like, if only we had this sort of breakdown of barrier, then suddenly people recognize their dignity in the mass or something like that? What was the thought process behind something like this?
Sure. I mean, the basic idea, which in my book turned around I have a whole chapter on this topic, and I quote many, many people who say this kind of thing. Their idea was that for many centuries, the Mass had become essentially the special province of the clergy. The clergy were the experts they were the technicians, in a sense, of liturgy who did the work, and the people knelt in the nave praying their own private devotions, praying the rosary, following in a book of meditations. Maybe if they were more, with the liturgical movement, maybe they were following in their missals, so they were actually more connected to the liturgy. But still, they were doing their own quiet, private thing in the nave of the church, while the clergy was doing the real liturgical work in the sanctuary. And they said, this is not how it should be. The liturgy is a work of everyone. Obviously, the priest has a special role. They're not denying that, except in the most radical heretics. But I mean, like the normal liturgists would say, yeah, the priest has a special role. He's the head. He represents Christ, the head. But the liturgy is an act of everyone, every member of the body, the members in union with the head, all of them worshiping God together. Now, that's true. And I don't think that the Old Mass ever denied that. And I don't think that people who went to the Old Mass, maybe they didn't think about it in these terms of active participation, but they were deeply involved. They went there to pray, which is the most important thing. They understood that the priest was offering a sacrifice to God on their behalf. If they were trained at all, if they had any catechesis, they knew they were supposed to unite themselves to that offering. It was very commonly said that when the priest lifted the paten at the offertory, and when he lifted the chalice, you were supposed to put yourself on the paten, or put your heart into the chalice, all these sorts of things. I've got all kinds of examples of devotional literature that talk this way. So there was, I think, a very what I would refer to as a deep, invisible spiritual bond between the lay people in the nave and the priests in the sanctuary and the clergy in the sanctuary. And I personally see that. I've come to experience that in my life as a much deeper form of actual participation. But, I'm just saying this is what the liturgists thought. They tended, if they had one error in common, it was that they tended to think that the only form of participation, or the best form, if there were many, was explicit, verbal, intellectual participation. So, in other words, you have to understand everything that's being said. So it has to be said out loud. It has to be in the vernacular. You have to make responses to it. Otherwise, if you're not acting in that way, you're somehow not really paying attention. You're not really involved. And to my mind, I mean, I'm in favor of people singing at the High Mass. If the choir is singing the Kyrie, or if the Kyrie and the Gloria are in Gregorian chant, go ahead and sing it. I think that's wonderful. Yeah. I've been a choir director. I always encourage people to sing, and to sing Et cum spiritu tuo, and to say Domine non sum dignus. I have no problem with that kind of vocal expression, but it's still more external and it's more superficial than the deeper participation of mind and heart. Right. And that's what I think devout Catholics had. And that's what I think was shattered by the dramatic and sudden changes and novelties that took place in the 60s and 70s. Right.
To be honest, and again, it's hard to pick up the pieces, but I talked to a lot of people who were there at the time of the changes, or certainly watched the fallout afterwards in their families. Right. So it's kind of hard to determine what premises I accept and what I deny. This idea that, there's such a disconnect in the liturgy. I've interviewed people who said, it's true that there were a lot of very hastily said low masses around this time. And if you want to kind of see the beautiful high mass, you'd go to the cathedral mass in your city or something. It seems like the fix to that, though, is what's kind of going on now. Like, you referenced the new liturgical movement. I'm sure you have plenty of work there. I love it. This is one of my even before I think I was a trad, I was already like reading a lot of the beauty and the depth that they write on their articles. And I'm just more and more convinced that if the church really believed that there was serious not understanding the significance of the Mass or of the traditions that are taught, would not the solution simply have been almost like we did with the Counter-Reformation, the explosion of better literature and media to help instruct the faithful? Instead, it feels like we decided just to sort of drop all these things which had given us such beauty in times past, if it was even necessary to drop. That's something I'm trying to piece together still.
Well, yeah, I don't think it's that hard to understand in the sense that what's very characteristic of the modern mentality, and this goes back a long ways, but certainly you find it very heavily in the 20th century. It's the mentality of it's a very mechanistic mentality. Like they think of the liturgy as a machine, and it's a machine that they feel is broken, and they want to go and fix it. And they think they can take it apart and put it back together and make a better machine, and then plug everybody into it, and everything's, and then you just hit the power button, and everything's going to just hum along, no problem. So a very kind of mechanical, rather simplistic notion that ignores intuition and imagination and custom and habit and all kinds of aspects of human life that don't fit into this technocratic paradigm. But what I'm saying is, like, in the 20th century, if there's a problem, the way people tend to think of solving it is to form a committee, create a bureaucracy, analyze, compartmentalize, dissect, reconstruct, and then roll out the new model, right? And that's exactly how the liturgy was approached. It was approached in a totally non-organic way. And Joseph Ratzinger says this too. Yep. So instead of saying, no, we have this inheritance, it's complex, it's sometimes bewildering, it's not simple, it formed over many, many centuries. We have to respect it because it's something very distinctive. It's ours. We're all used to it. Everybody's used to it. So what we're going to do is we're going to help people enter into it more deeply. We're not going to change it, but we're going to try to change ourselves to be better adapted to it, right? Yeah. This is one of my mottos. What needs change is not the liturgy, but ourselves, right? That's what needs change. And I just want to say this is very important because if you study the literature and you study the history of the 20th century, there were many successful cases of lay education in the liturgy. The whole enterprise of hand missals, for example, right? I think hand missals are a wonderful invention, and that's not because I think we should be slavishly attached to them, but they are an excellent tool to get to be familiar with the riches of the liturgy. And I like to say my hand missal is what made me a trad. Because I at a certain point, like after you get over the initial, hurdles of relating to the TLM, and you start to appreciate it, and you start to want to know more about it. You want to know a little bit more about what's going on. And so then when I had my hand missal and I figured out how to use it, then it was like, blossoming in front of me were all of these very rich prayers that are only in the old missal, not in the new missal. Yeah. And just reading that for several years on an almost daily basis, whether I was able to go to mass or not, sometimes I would just read the missal by myself as a form of prayer, which works really well, actually. But I got to be very familiar with the kind of flesh and blood and bones of the liturgy. And now at this point, having done this for decades, I don't need to look at my missal anymore. I mean, I sometimes will, but oftentimes I won't, because now I know what's going on, and I can relate to it in a different way, on a higher level, perhaps. So this was happening. And, there was this Monsignor in, I forget what city he was in, but his name was Martin Hellriegel, and he was a great educator, very great educator. And he taught the people in his parish and all the school children. He taught them the Mass. He taught them the Gregorian chants of the Mass. He explained the spirituality of the Mass to them. He had these people, they were firing on all cylinders. They were massively invested in and deeply connected to the Mass. And this was all before Vatican II, right? All of it. And the thing that's so tragic is that Monsignor Hellriegel lived to see all of that shattered, because when the changes happened, which were purportedly to make people, to make people participate better, they lost the ability to participate because the riches that they knew from tradition had been taken away from them suddenly. And now we were thrown into this wildly new environment and expected to swim in it, like being thrown into the deep end with no swimming practice. And I mean, I'm telling you, it was an absolute disaster. No matter how good the intentions were, there's no sociologist or psychologist or anthropologist on the planet who would say that you can change religious rituals that radically, that quickly, and not completely confuse people and dissociate them, right, from a religion. So whatever people think about the Novus Ordo, I mean, the way it was done was disastrous. It just was.
Well, and now the biggest thing is it's cut us off at the knees in such an unfortunate way. So again, going from the Novus Ordo to the Traditional Latin Mass, the reaction from everybody, even if they really like the TLM the first time they see it, is, well, I'm kind of lost. And
Yeah.
so, and for me, especially, like, I grew up in a very wonderful, close-knit Catholic household. So my dad, the two things that you'd hear is after every Mass, well, how was the Mass? Well, it's perfect. And also just learning, like, really remembering at a young age, my dad being like, wow, you can go to any country, anywhere in the world, and the Mass is the Mass. It's the same Mass that was there in the beginning, for every Mass that will happen and every Mass that has happened in the past. And it's very beautiful. But then to kind of go now and to kind of retroactively piece things together and recognize some of the, obviously, the very broad stroke changes between the new Mass and the Traditional Latin Mass, but even just the small things. Ad Orientem, again, just, I saw it, I just went, oh, I get it. You say something in the book which I really, really like, which is essentially how, there's a sort of intellectual tradition which we can spend a lot of tomes going over why Versus Populum had to happen and why it's important, and kind of goading you into a belief that somehow is a superior thing. But Ad Orientem doesn't need to, you don't need to read a book on, hey, is Ad Orientem or Versus Populum? It's organically baked in. It's the same way of, like, there's a vignette with Father Dwight Longenecker, who's great, talking about when he started celebrating Mass Ad Orientem. And I've heard this from multiple priests, but the biggest difference of the Latin Mass to the Novus Ordo, I think, is that it removes the priest, even a good holy priest, from having to sort of play out to the congregation. Suddenly they are intimately focused on the prayers. It helps their prayer, it helps our prayer. And I think it makes us recognize before God that the Mass isn't about you. God wants you there, but he doesn't need you there. And there actually is a great beauty in that truth, right? The understanding that you do prostrate ourselves before the feet of God in that way.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is why I think the traditional way of praying facing east is especially good for humility, because it enables you to surrender to God and not to have, I mean, if you're a priest, it's obvious you're not looking at the people, you're not in a sense having to show them that you are presiding well. You don't have to feel like you need to tell a story or a joke. You don't need to look pious. You don't need to do anything. You just need to pray to God for the people. That's what a priest is. And it's amazing to me that we have lost, since Vatican II, I think we've lost some of the most basic concepts of Christianity. And one of those basic concepts is in the letter to the Hebrews. A priest is set apart from men to offer gifts and sacrifices to God for sinners. Okay, that's what a priest is. He's not a facilitator of a communal event.
Yeah, he's not a community organizer.
He's not a presider. Yeah, I mean, or a president. Okay, sure, St. Justin Martyr, right? We have these indicate, he uses this word presider. Okay, fine. I don't care. That was a really long time ago. And also that was just a little quick sketch. It's not the full, you can't get from Justin Martyr or from any early Christian text a full picture of how Christians understand the liturgy. The full picture is what develops over all the centuries of Christian worship. And it's also, as I said, it's already there in the book of Hebrews and the book of Revelation, where you have this theocentric adoration. That's the essence of the Mass. It's God-focused adoration. And that's clear in the book of Revelation. That's clear in the letter to the Hebrews. And that's what the Mass should communicate to us immediately and intuitively. It shouldn't require that you read a book or watch a video series, with so-and-so, this expert, that expert. In fact, this is where I really think what you said is right on target. The Mass, when you go into it, should feel like you are stepping into another world. You're stepping into another domain. It's the domain of Christ, the King of heaven and earth. And it's the domain in which we fully acknowledge who he is and who we are in relation to him. It's the domain in which we let him offer himself and us with him to the Father. And therefore, it should be effortlessly focused on God, right? And not focused on ourselves. And this is where I think there's such a fundamental clash of paradigms between the Ad Orientem and the Versus Populum. It's a fundamental clash. They are not compatible. I like to say they are contrary catecheses. They teach us different things about what the Mass is. And I think it's not surprising that Versus Populum came in at the same time as this idea that the Mass is primarily a meal. It's a meal, a fellowship meal. Whereas Ad Orientem very obviously lends itself to the idea of the Mass as a sacrifice. Offered to God, right? And, yes, it's a sacrificial meal, but it's first a sacrifice, and then we partake of the sacrifice, right? Just like the Old Covenant priests did. They first sacrificed the animal to God, and then they got to eat some of the sacrificed animal. This is the way the Mass is. It's not a meal first and foremost. It's a sacrifice that we then partake of. So, so I think this is very important. I think this is, in fact, one last comment. Klaus Gomber, who was a great liturgist, Joseph Ratzinger really praised him highly. Klaus Gomber was the first, I think, really to say very clearly decades ago that the single worst change in the liturgical reform, and again, it wasn't mandated, but it was still something universally adopted, was to turn the priest around towards the people. He said, this undermines the character of Christian worship by making it anthropocentric, right? No one has ever been able to refute that. And you can't refute it because it's obvious to your senses.
Well, the biggest thing, and I would love to break this through, but recently, and I feel like, again, it's getting more rare, thank God, but I walked into a church not too long ago and I was horrified because the tabernacle wasn't to the center, which it's been a hot second since I've seen that. I was like, uh-oh. But the presider chair was there behind the altar. And I got to tell you, again, I mostly go to the Church of Latin Mass, but I do attend a few Novus Ordos, and it's always kind of good to kind of see like what's going on in there. But I'm so serious. I have not seen a presider's chair in the center in a very long time. So I had to kind of gawk because, again, it does give this sort of this human oriented, this human focused element to the Mass. And then B, just again, in terms of just the aesthetics of focus of a church, it's all eyes are on Father. He has to become an actor. He has to become the one holding it all down. It's not about the prayer. It's about him.
Exactly. Yeah. And let me just say something here, because I think this is very important for everyone to understand. One of the huge dynamics in the liturgical reform was what Pius XII called false antiquarianism, or some people call it archaeologism, but antiquarianism is probably an easier term to use. And the idea of false antiquarianism is this: if something was done earlier, it must be better or more authentic, and the earlier it is, the more authentic it is. Okay, and so built into that is the supposition that. And this is important, built into that is the supposition that as time goes on, the liturgy becomes corrupted. It drifts away from its original pristine purity. Okay. Now, Pius XII condemns that idea. And he says, no, the Holy Spirit is guiding the church throughout the whole of her history to develop her worship. And the things that are developed later are also valuable, and we shouldn't leapfrog over them to try to go back to some putative, original, pure form of worship. Now, there's a lot that can be said about this. The Protestants, as Guéranger says in his book, Liturgical Institutions, they were notorious antiquarians. They thought that they were going to get rid of all of this medieval claptrap, all the relics, all the superstition, all the, the idolatry of bread, whatever. And they were going to jump back to the early Christian, basically brotherhood meal, the agape. That's what they thought they were going to get back to. So the Protestants have done this for centuries now. And it's, of course, scandalous, I would say, that Catholics kind of jumped on that bandwagon.
The breaking apart. I heard a very famous bishop say that the purpose of Vatican II was to help open up the medieval doors of the church. And I thought, well, that seems a little mean on the poor medievals. They seem to be doing a lot of good.
But, okay, so let me get back. So the reason I'm talking about this antiquarianism is this. One of the things that you can see in very old churches, very early Christian, paleo-Christian churches, to use the fancy term, is you can see a structure where you have a freestanding altar, and then there's an apse, and around the back of the apse, which is curved, and of course this would be facing typically eastwards, and therefore the sacrifice was offered eastwards. But anyway, but behind the apse and on the, you would have chairs set up for the bishop and his clergy, which is what later developed into something like the canon, the canons at a cathedral, right, with their bishop. And so, yes, you can find examples of places where the bishop would have been sitting in the center, on a throne, in a sense. This is like a judge in a Roman basilica, surrounded by his court, as it were. Okay, fine. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, yeah, that's the way it was in Paleo-Christian churches. Well, fast forward 1,000 years, and Catholics have Catholics have realized slowly that they don't want to put a man in the central place. What they're going to put in the central place instead is a high altar that is visually dominant, that's going to draw your eyes towards the altar, which is a symbol of Christ, and upwards to God with this kind of vertical thrust that is so typical of Western ecclesiastical architecture, as opposed to Byzantine architecture that has a different kind of way of working. And then fast forward another 500 years, and now you're into the Renaissance and eventually Counter-Reformation period, and that's when the ideas continue to mature, and they say, well, let's not just have the altar in the center of the church, attracting all eyes, and now there's no longer a presider's chair there, but let's put the tabernacle in the center as well. And let's reserve the Blessed Sacrament there in the center. That was a later development. But it makes sense, because now you come into a church, and what do you have? You have a complete visual unification of altar, tabernacle, and crucifix, right? And if you think about that, even for 2 seconds, theologically, that makes perfect sense. Here's the altar of sacrifice. Here's the Lamb of God really present as the bread of life and the bread of angels. And here's the crucifix, which is the symbol of our redemption by the blood of Christ, which is what we represent at every Mass. So this unification of altar, tabernacle, and crucifix, which is so typical of a Catholic church from the past 500 years, it makes sense. It wasn't some kind of accident or some kind of experiment or some sort of like random swerve, like, oh, we just did that for the heck of it. No, it was something that it was like the final ripe, mature fruit of so many centuries of devotion to the Mass and the Eucharist. And then here's the key. Here's the kicker, right? Once you have something like that in a church, if you then, in the 20th century, break it apart suddenly and say, guess what? We're not going to have a fancy high altar anymore, but just a table. We're not going to have the tabernacle there, but it's going to go off to the side, and Father is going to go back into the center, right? That screams a totally different message than anything that the early Christians would ever have been thinking, right? It's not the same. You can't just cancel out 15 centuries of development and say, we're going to have the same meaning that somebody in the 2nd century had. You don't even know what they were thinking anyway, but it's not going to be the same thing as when you've habituated people to a certain way of thinking and a certain way of visualizing and a certain way of participating in the Mass, and then you shatter that suddenly. What that sends is the signal of Father is the center of attention, that the real presence of Christ is somehow marginal or something that can be put in a broom closet, and the altar isn't an altar of sacrifice anymore. Now it's just a table, right? That's the message you're sending, not some kind of pure paleo-Christian message. So I'm just telling you that people they need to think more carefully about the message that is sent by any liturgical reform. It sends a message, whether you intend it to or not, it's going to send a certain message, right?
A couple of years ago, there was the National Eucharistic Congress started, right? Yeah. And so to address the fact that the majority of Catholics do not believe in the real presence. I think they said 60% of Catholics don't believe in the real presence. So part of this was there was a ton of classes and books and programs and all this other kind of stuff coming out. But what I noticed, I thought, was that the most consequential thing that would happen would be at the parish level. And I saw this even in my own hometown parish growing up, where suddenly the tabernacle, which growing up, by the way, had been moved to the side of the altar, and the presider's chair was behind growing up. Suddenly, the priest at my parents' church, it moved into the center, and the presider's chair moved off to the side, and then he also got kneelers, and so
Yep.
communion there. It's wild because I grew up. It was a church I would say is very it's very Spirit of Vatican II. I'm very fortunate that I don't think there was anything heterodox in its teaching, but certainly, a little, we getting a sermon on hell or something. We had to wait for our Polish priest to come in for that, or something like that. But the point being is that even these small changes, it's been very wild to go back home and to see like the place that I grew up in, that was guitars and tambourines and communion on the hand,
Sure.
is moving back to worship of God that is obviously just demonstrably more fitting.
Yes.
And that's something that I'm seeing all over. So it's very interesting because I've read some of the reasonings of some of these liturgical reforms, and all I can kind of see is, by any metric, wouldn't the Catholic Church at this point recognize that if she really wanted to help foster belief in the real presence, belief in the sacrifice of the Mass, belief in the importance of the sacrifice, the priest in persona Christi, wouldn't you just say it looks like all these developments, these gradual good changes that we've had that have obviously placed a greater emphasis on the Eucharist and on the sacrifice of the Mass? Why wouldn't we just adjust ourselves or returning to that more stridently? Like, how many more years do we need of tinkering?
Yes. No, it's true. And I mean, I think, just to be completely honest, the current leaders of the church, mainly I'm talking about the bishops, but also sometimes older pastors, they are not yet ready to take the radical steps. They're not yet ready to take the radical steps that need to be taken. They are too wedded to the post-conciliar reform project. They still either believe that it's somehow working, even though all the evidence is against that, all the data is against it, or that it could be made to work if we just try harder, or whatever it is. But they're just not ready to admit that certain things have failed, and certain things failed the people of God. Certain things harmed the people of God. So the turning around of the priest to face the people, it harmed the priests and it harmed the people. Giving communion in the hand to people standing harmed faith in the real presence. And it also causes a problem with fragments that are lost. And that, again, is something that we know is a problem, but the people in charge don't want to admit it yet as a problem. The loss of our sacred music, of Gregorian chant, of polyphony, of the pipe organ, this has had profound consequences on the transmission and the living of the Catholic faith, because, as Plato and Aristotle recognized, music forms our souls in a way that's unique, that nothing else can do. And the music of the church, which was unique to it, is unique to it. It breathes a spirit of sacredness, and it's obviously written for God and consecrated to God. It's sacred music. It's not secular music. Everybody knows that. Almost everybody can recognize that chant and palestrina are not secular music, but that they have a churchy sound to them. Right?
Can I tell you right on this point too? So when I was in Los Angeles, my joke was that secular Hollywood doesn't believe the Second Vatican Council happened, because you could take the most secular person in LA and say, okay, romantic comedy, it's the end of the film, the couple's getting together. I need them to have a great Catholic wedding. Here's your budget, go off on it. And I'll tell you, I know the churches, they film at these beautiful churches. They would get all the robes, all the incense, the altar proper, like the choir boys. It's amazing that somehow we intune that in our souls, even as non-Catholics, but yet we spend so much time fighting about it now that we are Catholics.
Exactly. So, I mean, I'm just saying I could multiply a lot of examples where the fixes that need to occur, if I can put it that way, I don't really like that language because that sounds like the mechanistic analogy. Let's put it this way. The goods that we need to recover from our tradition, which grew up in our tradition by divine providence and which were fruitful for centuries, we know that. These goods can be relatively easily and put back into place and at a fairly low cost. If the bishops and the pastors were willing to put their weight behind it. And they're not yet willing to do that. Therefore, they'd rather spend millions of dollars on Eucharistic congresses and on, the beatification or canonization of Fulton Sheen and all these sort of, I guess it's beatification.
Yeah, beatification. Yeah. Here in St. Louis, it's going to be, fun fact.
I mean, they're going to spend huge amounts of money on these various events. And yeah, I'm sure that these events will do some good, but they're kind of like rock concerts. Like they get
Yeah,
people worked
you're
up for a
so
short
right.
time, and then
Hmm.
they go away, and it's like, oh, I've got a hangover, and and then life goes back to normal.
Hmm.
And you don't have that kind of abiding, subtle change that is necessary, and that can be done by returning to tradition. And this, look, it's. I always say to people, it's not rocket science.
It's not.
Every aspect of tradition developed for a good reason.
Hmm.
This is what I write in my books. If people are interested in read the book Turned Around. That's the best book to read. If somebody wants to find out, why did the traditional Latin Mass develop as it did? Why is it good for it to be the way it is? And every attempt we've made to improve on this work of 2,000 years maturation has failed. They all get Fs, D minuses, C minuses,
Yeah,
whatever.
if we audited us like a business, this would be a
Yeah,
bad business.
exactly. And then of course people make the objection, well, how can you say that, because there are still lots of flourishing churches with the Novus Ordo. Look, I'm not saying that there's nothing good in the Novus Ordo, and I'm not saying that people can't get spiritual nourishment from hearing scripture and from receiving the Holy Eucharist and so on. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is things could be a lot better, and those people could be getting a lot more out of their liturgical life. Their liturgy could be glorifying God more and could be sanctifying their souls more if they had the powerful tools of tradition. That's what I'm saying. For me, this is all about, I'm not ever trying to attack anybody. I'm never trying to say anybody's a second-class Catholic. What I'm saying is there are goods that the church has in her treasure chamber, and these belong to you. They're your birthright. Use them and profit from them. I want people to have more, right?
Yes.
I don't want to have more and see other people have less. I want everybody to have more,
Yeah. No, you said something on Matt Fradd's podcast, one of your episodes on them. And just to tell you, it's very honoring when you listen to a 3-hour podcast of somebody. So you're welcome. I was like, so it was great. No, but you said, the church is it's a library of treasures, I think is the analogy that you were talking about. And so she is traveling. She's like a caravan. She's traveling throughout the entirety of history with all these different tools at her disposal. And different time periods, it's like different battles. You take a different tool that you need to kind of get the job done. There might be a time where you have to address a particular heresy, and therefore you may take one tool that was really effective in this time, and then you might have to adjust to a different tool. But what you don't do is you don't need to drop your extra tools by the wayside. They just go back in storage. And what I've discovered, especially as I become more, my coming to the traditional Latin Mass, the traditional theology has deepened my love of Jesus, because suddenly I was understanding he as King of the universe. The social kingship of Christ, I think, becomes very alive here in St. Louis. It's very apparent around Christ the King. And now that I've kind of seen this, you just say, well, we ought to be giving our best to the Lord. And the moment that we start just focusing inward about us, how easy is it? It's such a short span of time that things start falling apart. And I've thought, especially for the priest is not a community organizer, you said earlier. He's not a presider. He's supposed to be standing as a spiritual shepherd for his flock. And I think we should equip him with every tool that he needs, because obviously as a priest, he has a target on his back already. It's so easy for a priest to just for the mass to become a performance. We've been to masses like that. And how easy would it be just by turning to the east to refocus? I mean, physically with our bodies. You say something in the book about how again, there's a language of words, of course, and they can explain things, but there's also the language of the body. Like you don't have to explain. Like the gestures of your body also communicate sometimes more powerfully than words ever could.
Absolutely. No, I mean, this is something I talk about in Turnaround in various places, that a lot of research has been done about body language and about the way people communicate with their faces, with their eyes, with their hands. I like to talk with my hands. With posture, in all sorts of ways that are picked up and interpreted by people in a very subtle, intuitive way. And so a lot of communication goes on underneath the surface, not just with our words. And that's true of the liturgy as well. The liturgy is this whole universe, this cosmos of symbols. And symbols take all different sorts of forms. People might tend to think of a symbol as something really obvious, like a chalice, right? A chalice it's a vessel, but a vessel is a symbol. It's something that holds something else. And so, it already has this multivalent, there's a lot that you can think about when you think about a chalice, I mean, most especially you can think about the soul receiving God's grace, and you can think about Our Lady as a chalice who receives Christ into her womb. There are all these things that, I mean, symbols are by definition something that they are, here's another word, polysemous. They have a lot of meanings. Multivalent is the term I used before, but polysemous is probably a better one. But also people forget that gestures are symbols, right? Yes. Like when the priest says "sursum corda" and lifts his hands up, right? That's a symbol. When he faces east, that's a symbol. When he's silent, that's a symbol, right? So the Mass is just saturated with symbols from beginning to end. And what I try to help people to see is that you can have good symbols and bad symbols, or maybe I should say you can have effective symbols and then counter-effective symbols. You can actually have counter symbols. That is, symbols that suggest something other than what the liturgy should be suggesting, right? This would be like, I mean, this is terrible. This doesn't really happen anymore as far as I know, but in the 1960s and maybe 70s, there sometimes were masses celebrated by hippie priests, and they would use like a Coke glass or something like that, instead of a chalice, right? Well, that's an anti-symbol. It's something that carries so much of a worldly signification with it that it actually contradicts what the liturgy is trying to communicate there. Maybe even a better example would be the use of guitar music and piano music in church. That's an anti-symbol. Yeah. I can't get into the reasons why right now. I wrote a whole book about that called Good Music, Sacred Music, and Silence. But the point is that we're living in a symbolic universe, and the liturgy is like a microcosm of that symbolic universe. And therefore, everything that's done in it needs to be well chosen for its purpose. Right. And one thing I love about the traditional Latin Mass, if it's done well, which it typically is, I would say nowadays, right? We don't, my experience, I've gone all over the world and I've had almost entirely positive experiences with the traditional Mass. It is a world in which the dense network of symbols has all been thought out and worked out so well over so many centuries that it's kind of like, it's like a masterful poem, It's like Homer's Odyssey. It's like Shakespeare. It's like Milton. But I mean better than these things. Yeah. But because it's been refined and matured over such a long period. All you have to do as a layman, it seems sometimes intimidating and scary to people, but all you have to do is just surrender to it. Let your eyes adjust to the gloaming. Let yourself be carried along by this rhapsody, right? This is what you need to do. Just let it do its work on you and let it take time, right? Give it weeks, months, years. I mean, here's a great thing about the traditional liturgy. I've been going for more than 30 years now. And I'm still discovering new things about it. It's a lifelong apprenticeship. You never get to the bottom of it. And isn't that wonderful? Like, instead of being frustrated and saying, I can't understand this, this is too hard, this is too complicated. No, it's like, no, guess what? You'll never get bored of it because you can just keep going. It's like, so this is where I think we just have such a powerhouse here, such a treasury.
Doctor, I wish we could talk longer, but you just have to come on again. That's why I say all my guests. But this was so fun. So please, friends, real quick, at Orientem, The Direction That Changes Everything is the latest, this small, powerful book I'm reading. But also, please tell us some more of your latest reads, or also where to find your work, where to best to discover you that way.
Sure. Yeah, I have a website called peterkwasniewski.com. And it doesn't matter if you can't spell it, because your search engine will probably find it for you anyway. It's seen everything, I'm sure. And then, so you can go there and see the list of my books. I have a book about Catholic social teaching, by the way. That's my most recent one. It's called His Reign Shall Have No End, Catholic Social Teaching for the Lion-Hearted. And that book is all about Christ the King. So if you're interested in the social kingship of Christ, that's something you might want to check out. I also run a publishing company called Osjusti Press. You know that because you had Anna Kalinowska on your show, and I published her book called Clothed with Beauty. Actually, I happen to have a copy I happen to have a copy of that right here. That's what this one looks like. So
one of my favorite reads of the year. Get it, people.
That's her book. So I published this with my press, but I just released yesterday a new book that is worth mentioning. It's called A Liberal Revolution by Hannah L. Bianchi, The Implementation of Vatican II in the Archdiocese of Baltimore. So what this historian does, it's actually a really, really fascinating read, because what this man has done is he spent 10 years doing archival research to basically reconstruct what happened in Baltimore during and after Vatican II. How was it implemented? What was the bishop saying? What were the priests doing? What were the lay people saying and thinking? How were they reacting? So it's the best thing. I've read a lot about Vatican II. I mean, probably more than a lot of people have, let's just say it that way. And this is the book that, to me, brings me closest to the experience of being right there and having a sense of like, yeah, this is what they thought they were going to accomplish. This is where they went wrong. This was the effect of it. I mean, I think I really honestly think this is a book that anyone who's interested in the Vatican II debate should read. So you asked me to mention something recent. That's the most recent thing. So
that's great. It's also thanks to you. I read a great book published by Ostiusi, which was about the Cristero War.
Yes. The Cristero counter-revolution. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's right.
Gosh, talk about inspiring. I mean, well, and horrifying and inspiring history, but
very much. I am very, very honored that you came on with me. Thank you so much. Friends, please check out all those links to those books. I'm actually going to buy The Liberal Revolution literally when we log off. And of course, we want to hear from you. So if you're in the comment sections, maybe you've discovered the beauty of the Mass in Ad Orientem. Maybe you're in. I've seen them popping around. I know that some of y'all watch me who go to the new Mass, but you guys have Novus Ordos that are celebrating Mass Ad Orientem. And I've talked to some of your priests who've also been able to discover, I think, deeper love of Jesus through that. So, you know, we'll get there. But I'm very happy to see that happening. Please, friends, don't forget to share this video far and wide. And of course, to leave a like and a comment and subscribe if you haven't already to the Glad Trad podcast. Until next time, thank you all so much for watching. God bless you and may He keep you. Adios.